Good afternoon, gardeners. It's Sunday, June 13th, and today is one of the most exciting days I've ever had in the garden because today I'm going to begin my fig breeding experiment.
If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell to receive new video notifications, and check out our Amazon storefront and spread shop in the video description for a list of the gardening products I use and awesome custom designed apparel and other gear. Your support is greatly appreciated.
Fig breeding is one of the most amazing dances in nature, and that's because figs are pollinated through a natural process called mutualism. Each individual species of fig has to be pollinated by a little tiny individual species of a wasp. Now, in the United States, you can only find the fig wasp necessary to pollinate fig trees in choice areas of California where they were established by commercial growers 125 years ago. And throughout most of the world, you will not find this specific variety of fig wasp either. So I have to breed figs that have a mutated persistent allele that will set fruit without pollination. If this sounds very confusing to you, please go to the link above, watch my first part of this series, which explains all of the science behind fig tree pollination. If you are familiar with this process, you already know that I will need pollen from a persistent male caprifig to hand pollinate the female figs in order to get seed with the persistent mutated allele and hope that I can wind up with some number of female fig trees that I can grow and fruit here without the fig wasp. So great news, I found this fig on the ground today. This is a ripe male caprifig fruit off of this UCR 271-1 Salib caprifig from the University of California, Riverside. So let's begin the pollination process. So if you're all caught up with how fig pollination works, you will know that the breva crop of the male fig is actually what contains the pollen, and what we need to fertilize is the main crop of the female fig tree. Full disclosure, this is the first time I'm ever going to be doing any of this, so this is going to be a big learning curve and I'm going to be learning along the way. What you need to know is that this pollen has to be mature pollen, and I have to manually insert this into the ostiole of the main crop of the female fig. So the problem is that the female fig tree that I want to use for breeding purposes is not quite ready yet. The figs are not at an advanced enough stage where I can access the ostiole. This right here is the ostiole of the female fig. That is where I need to insert the fig pollen, and I think these are all a little bit too small yet. Now, hand pollinating your figs all comes down to timing. It can't be too early, but it also can't be too late. If you wait and you hand pollinate your female figs too late, then the seed will not have enough time to properly develop the embryos before the fruit ripens. So I can't wait too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to harvest the male pollen. Inside, I'm going to store that pollen in my fridge for a little bit. I'm going to wait for more of the ostioles on this fig tree to swell, and then I am going to try and inject that pollen into the ostiole. Now, in my research, fig pollen can be stored in the refrigerator for a few weeks in an airtight container. So right here I have a glass dish that I put in the microwave for 45 seconds to sterilize, and I let it cool down. It also comes with an accompanying lid. I'm also going to be using gloves for this because cleanliness is everything when you're trying to preserve the integrity of this experiment. Right now you'll notice I only have this one caprifig that fell off the tree. That's because I don't know exactly how ripe the pollen needs to be. If this already fell off the tree, maybe this pollen is overripe, or maybe it's perfect. Either way, I only have a handful of figs on the tree, so I'm going to use them one by one. So I'm going to cut this open and hope that there is some pollen inside. And here you can see the inside of the male caprifig. I'm going to try to get the pollen out of there. And it actually doesn't look like that there is a whole lot of pollen in there, and that is kind of what I was afraid of. So now I'm going to go outside and I'm going to try and harvest a couple of less ripe ones to see if there's more pollen. So I went outside and I harvested the other Profici crop, and they were all in the process of drooping, but some are further than others. So I'm going to try this one now. And you can see this one is a little less developed. So I'm going to try to see if I can squeeze any pollen out of that. It looks like next to nothing is coming out. A little bit is falling out of the flowers. Just a little bit. So try this one. Ooh, and this one's dropping some pollen. This one's really dropping a good amount of pollen in there. So I'm definitely not getting a lot of pollen grains out of here, but I only need a little bit per individual female fig. So I seem to be having the best luck extracting the pollen by spanking the back of the figs. So I'm going to try and proceed with that method. We're going to do this with all of these figs. You can see what it looks like. Ooh, there's a ton of pollen in this one. That is a very good sign. And what you can actually see falling out here, the larger chunks are actually the flowers of the male caprifig. Now we're going to try to pick out those flowers very gently. Here you can actually see what the male flowers of the caprifig look like. Those are the male flowers that contain the pollen. And here's the inside of our glass storage container. You can see all of the pollen sprinkled in there. It kind of looks like garlic powder. So now I'm going to put the lid on this and I'm going to place it in the refrigerator until the female figs are large enough to accept the pollen, which should only be a few days to maybe a week away. So I've been doing a lot of research on different methods of hand pollination, and of course I learned after I collected my fig pollen that one of the most common things that fig breeders do is after they collect their caprifigs, they cut them in half and then they let them dry out indoors for about 24 hours to let the centers dry out, and that allows you to collect the pollen more efficiently. So I didn't get to do that, but if you're going to perform this experiment, you may want to consider allowing your figs to air dry for 24 hours in a cool, dry, dark place to better collect more pollen. However, I still have enough pollen for me to conduct this experiment. Now, I've researched many ways that growers over the years have hand pollinated figs, and it seems like the most common way is that people have taken an awl and they've punched holes into the bottom of the figs and they've tried to manually blow the pollen in. And these methods are very prone to failure because number one, it's very hard to see the pollen. Number two, it's very hard to direct the pollen outside when it's windy. And number three, when you puncture a fig, they tend to generate a caustic sap to seal themselves, so it's hard to get the pollen in there. One of the easiest and most effective ways that I've researched is creating a suspension by emulsifying the pollen inside purified water and then injecting it with a hypodermic needle into the fig. And this is effective because you don't have to deal with the hard to see dusty pollen granules. And in my research, you can enhance the pollination effect of these suspension solutions by making them roughly 2 to 5% sucrose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a 2% sucrose solution using distilled water right here. And why distilled water? Because it's purified, it's simply condensed steam, so there are no impurities. So we are simply going to tare our scale right here, and now that we're at 0, I'm going to pour myself 200 milliliters of water. And I'm not going to use anywhere near this much water, I'm just going to make a suspension out of it, so I need an overabundance of it, because I need to heat it up to melt the sugar. So we're right there at 201. I'm going to take this off the scale, then I'm going to set the unit to grams, and I'm going to use just plain old granulated white sugar, which is pure sucrose, and I need 4 grams of this. So 4 grams of sugar mixed in 200 milliliters of water will give me that 2% solution, and then I will be able to up it by heating up the water just a little bit, because I'm going to get some level of evaporation. So if I start at 2% and heat it, and I lose a little bit of the water to evaporation, I'm going to wind up with something a little bit higher than a 2% solution. So now I am simply going to heat up this solution until all of the sugar melts. And it's not going to take long, it's only going to take about 1 minute. You don't need to bring it to a boil or anything, you just need to dissolve the sugar completely. And now we've made our 2% sucrose solution, so I'm going to leave it on the countertop to cool and cover it so nothing, no impurities get inside the solution. And I'm going to allow it to fully cool down to room temperature because you cannot inject a hot solution into the fig for obvious reasons. So this is the perfect time to take my good buddy Dale for a walk. You want to go for a walk, buddy? Oh, he's ready to go. Dale wants to go for a walk. So Dale and I just got back from our walk, and as you can see, lots of condensation has formed on the lid. So that has ever so slightly increased the concentration of the sucrose in our mix. And if I use this thermometer, you can see we're at 90.3 Fahrenheit, 32.4 Celsius, and that is more than cool enough to do this experiment because the figs are getting warmer than that just sitting out in the sun. So now we're going to make the sucrose suspension out of our fig pollen, and here I have the fig pollen that I collected 4 days ago, back on June 13th. So I'm going to take this out of the bag. So when it comes to concentrations of pollen, everything that I found from professional breeders, we're dealing with fractions of a gram, which is an incredible amount of pollen. So I have to just kind of eyeball this because I'm only dealing with a dusting. So I'm going to take this measuring cup and I'm going to see what about 20 milliliters gets me. I pretty much have to do this all by eye. So that's 23 milliliters. And I need to see if I can suspend that pollen. And it clearly looks like it is, that is a fair amount of pollen density. So I think I can probably stretch that to maybe 25 milliliters or so. So now I have my fig pollen, and I also have some sterile syringes. These are 10 milliliter syringes with 21 gram, or with 21 gauge tips, needles rather, 21 gauge needles. So with this 25 milliliters of solution, I should be able to fill them up with a little bit more to spare, so I don't take a whole lot of air bubbles in. That's why I filled it a little bit beyond 20 milliliters. So I'm going to try and keep this suspension as active as possible. And now I'm going to attempt to fill up these syringes with the pollen solution. Now I may have my first problem here, and maybe I shouldn't have used the 21 gauge needles. They may be too thin, so either the pollen completely dissolved and I can't really see the pollen inside the hypodermic needles, or I should have gotten 18 gauge needles that would be wider. So now I need to hedge my bets. I need to inject my figs with these syringes as planned, and then use the tips of the hypodermic needles to try and mop up the pollen granules in the bottom and try to install them manually into the ostiole. So hopefully between the solution and manually getting the tips covered and whatever pollen remains, I will be able to successfully pollinate these figs. Now it's time to inject our figs with the solution and try to pollinate them. Now timing is everything when it comes to this procedure. In nature, the wasp has to crawl through the ostiole of the fig. So you have to make sure that you're neither too early or too late. If the figs are too small, you won't be able to get the needle through because the ostiole won't be developed enough. But if you wait too long until the ostiole gets too large, the pollen won't sit inside the fig long enough to develop mature seed. And that's very important. So you want to be able to inject these figs as soon as the ostiole develops enough. Then you can get the needles inside cleanly, but give it maximum time to develop mature seed before you harvest the fig. So right here is a white Madeira #1 fig, and you can see right here there's this little tiny open dot in the ostiole. And that little tiny open dot would be where the fig wasp would crawl through. So I think this fig is right about at the right level where I want it to be to insert the needle. However, just to be sure, I'm also going to inject the pollen into some others at varying stages, just to make sure I cover my bases and get figs in varying levels of developments. So I'm going to take my hypodermic needle and gently shake it to stir up the pollen. Hopefully that pollen's in there. And now I'm going to insert the needle directly inside the ostiole until I feel resistance. And it feels like it went all the way through. Now I'm going to inject it with pollen until a little bit leaks out. And you see that drip out there? Now hopefully I did this correctly and I did not water my solution down too much, and I didn't pick too small of a needle that I didn't get the pollen granules in there. And now for one of the most important parts. I need to make sure that I mark all of the figs that I pollinated so I don't accidentally harvest them and eat them. So I'm going to use these yellow organza bags. And the hypodermic needles, the organza bags, I'm going to link to them all on my Amazon storefront in the video description. But I need to make absolute certain that I do not get these mixed up. So we're going to use yellow to mark the figs that I pollinated with the syringe. And then throughout the year, my other figs I'm going to mark with green bags that I did not pollinate. So I always use the organza bags to keep pests out of my figs. Well, I'm going to specifically use yellow here as a marker and use green for all the ones I'm allowed to eat. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pollinate a bunch of other ones on this tree with the same injection method, and then I'm going to bag them yellow as well. Now that I've pollinated my white Madeira #1, the next one I'm going to do is Del San Juan Gran. And this ostiole of this fig is not nearly as enlarged and open as the white Madeira #1, so it's clearly different. But nonetheless, I'm going to try to find an entry point with this needle. And it did slide in there nice and easy, but it does seem like there's a lot more fig sap. And I got the water in there, and it is dripping out. So now we are going to close that up as well. We're going to pollinate a number of figs on this tree. And now the very last fig that I'm going to try to hand pollinate is this Pollinate gigantina, which is one of my all-time favorite figs. So again, we're going to go in the ostiole, and then we are going to flood the ostiole with the solution. And now it's clearly dripping out. And then we're going to bag up this guy as well and do the same thing to a handful of other figs on this tree. So I've injected all of the figs that I could with the solution, and the solution is now gone. However, just in case I messed things up, I had the foresight to save one caprifig on my tree, with the idea that if I mess things up terribly, I'll at least be able to dip a needle directly into the pollen of the caprifig and then manually jam that needle into the tree, or into the ostiole of the fig. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just roll the edge of the flowers around in the pollen, and then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to manually stab that into the ostiole of the fig trees, of the female figs rather, and I am going to bag them up with a white bag, a white organza bag, in order to keep them separate, because I want to differentiate between the ones that I stabbed directly with the pollen and the ones that I injected to see what method works better. And here's my white Madeira #1 tree. Again, the white bags are the ones that I manually rubbed the ends of the needles and pollen and stuck them inside, and the yellow bags are the ones that I injected with the sucrose solution. This tree right here is my Del San Juan Gran. And this tree right here is my Pollinate gigantina, all hand pollinated. So hopefully my plan works and I wind up getting some viable seed thanks to my persistent caprifig. Now the way I see it, there are two downsides to this project. The first downside is that I have a bunch of figs that will be, in theory, the first to ripen on my trees that I can't even eat because I have to preserve their integrity and see if the seeds are viable. And on top of that, they're also my 3 favorite varieties. That's why I'm selecting them for breeding. So now I have a bunch of figs that are my absolute favorites that I can't even eat. But the second downside is that I'm going to be waiting about 60 to 90 days to find out if this hand pollination method even works. work. So after the figs ripen completely on the trees, I'm going to have to scoop out the pulp, and I'm going to have to take the little tiny endocarps, which are the things that look like seeds inside of the figs, and I'm going to have to place them in water. And what will happen is, if the endocarps filled with seeds, they will become dense and they will sink to the bottom of a glass of water. If all of the endocarps float on the top, that means the experiment was a failure and that they are hollow inside. But if they sink, that means I will have viable seed that I can attempt to germinate. Again, the downside is I really won't know for 2 to 3 months. So what I did to try and hedge my bets is, I have a number of figs that I am virtually certain are Smyrna figs. I've had these fig trees for 2 or 3 seasons, and every year they are dropping on me. Those varieties are 3N Prato, another variety called Meteorito, and another variety called Sangue de Drago Rosso. Some of the figs on those trees are already starting to shrivel up, and they're hollow inside, and they're already dropping figs. So that's how I know that they're more than likely Smyrna figs. So what I did was I injected a bunch of them with the solution, and my theory behind that is, if they persist on the tree and they don't fall off, then I know that my pollination method worked, and I'm going to know that 1 to 2 months ahead of time. So it's going to be a little bit of a gauge for me. If they hold on the fig trees, then I know I'm probably going to be successful, and I'm going to be really excited about my results behind me. If they start falling off, I'm going to be kind of disappointed. That means that my method was not successful. So in terms of garden experiments, this is definitely one of the crazier ones that I've done, and definitely one of the most niche. However, if it is successful, it is going to be really cool, and I hope it will yield some amazing results. Now, as I mentioned before, it's going to be about a 2 to 3 month delay before I can make my next video update on the subject, because I need the figs to mature to see if the seed is viable. However, assuming everything goes according to plan, I should have an update at some point between 60 and 100 days from now. So if you found this video helpful, please make sure to hit that like button, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe for future updates and more videos like these. If you're curious about any of the products that I used in this video or in my garden in general, they are all linked in my Amazon storefront down in the video description. Thank you all again so much for watching, and both Dale and I hope to see all of you again on the next video. Dale is so tired he can't even get up to howl.